My name is Frangella. I do a lot of freelance work in the 3D industry and that sort of stuff for TV, stadium stuff, web video, a lot of things like that. And I also do a weekly tutorial blog on motiontutorials.net where I go over kind of 3D animation, motion graphics, visual effects, film, and that sort of stuff. A lot of stuff with sports, visual effects, 3D modeling, all sorts of stuff that kind of comes up on news, TV. There's a lot that goes into and going on around the 3D industry. And I kind of come to you with a background in graphic design and kind of the initial Adobe suite of stuff. That's kind of where I like to focus because that's kind of the transition and process I went through of trying to figure out how to get from kind of the familiarity of something like Photoshop or Illustrator, even like Flash or After Effects when you're doing animation into 3D, because it can kind of be a big jump and things can look a little different and foreign. It can be kind of a painful process, and there's a lot of different options. So that's kind of where I like to focus some of my videos and educational stuff, is kind of on that transition point where you're familiar with some sort of design stuff, you're used to working in one industry and trying to figure out how all these things connect and work together, because there are also a lot of options and kind of figuring out how to use different tools in different ways. As opposed to something like Illustrator, there's kind of, the one tool. If you're going to do illustration or logos, you use that. There's a lot of options. You can use kind of a lot of different workflows, but also keep in mind thinking it as, if you spend a while, as an example, trying to learn how to ride a bike, and then you decide that you want to learn to ride a different bike, it's knowledge that you can kind of take from one application and move to another. And I see that a lot with people being apprehensive and hesitant or just kind of overwhelmed because it seemed like such a big choice of, do I choose this or this or this, and not seeing it as kind of a permanent thing, but as it's all kind of related. So the couple of things I want to talk about today are 3D and Photoshop and getting off the ground with that and kind of how it works and what it can do, as well as a newer app that Adobe has, which is Adobe Fuse. And so I want to kind of briefly talk about what they are and what they aren't, and then get into some fun demos. So kind of how I see Photoshop as as it relates to some of the other tools like Cinema 4D, Maya, 3D, and After Effects, is it's kind of dipping your toes in the water of 3D, of you can kind of get used to how things work, kind of understand things like lighting, textures, rendering, but it's packaged in a familiar environment. That's kind of the pain area I've seen of, if you are used to things like Photoshop, Illustrator, and all the Adobe stuff, it all kind of looks like one cohesive thing. So even if you haven't used something like Audition or Premiere, if you open it up, it kind of feels familiar. Whereas 3D stuff can look totally different, and even from one 3D app to another, it looks kind of totally foreign. And kind of go through what it's good at. So it's really good for getting quick 3D titles and text, 3D logos, and also transitioning that stuff into 3D printing if you're into that, without having to get bogged down in the details. The newer one, which is super fun, which I'll get into, is Adobe Fuse, which is a new 3D character creator app from Adobe. So this came about after they bought Mixamo, which was a character rigging kind of in the gaming industry, to make it easier to get 3D characters built rigged without getting stuck in kind of the not as fun parts that can kind of be a lot more technical, like rigging and that sort of stuff, which I don't even like to do. And then being able to take those after you build them and put it into either Photoshop very quickly through CC libraries, or if you want to eventually get into really picking it apart and customizing it and sending it to other 3D apps, you can send it to the Mixamo site, also through Creative Cloud Libraries, and add animation and mocap data and do stuff that way. Kind of the couple things I want to go through and talk about is kind of getting off the ground with Photoshop 3D, creating this 3D logo and kind of how stuff works, as well as talking about this Adobe Fuse app where you can kind of create this custom 3D character and then do stuff like add animation, all sort of stuff, without getting bogged down in kind of the technical details. That's kind of the fun of a lot of this stuff, is it takes this overwhelming part of it away. So kind of as opposed to the typical Photoshop layer system, all of that sort of stuff, if I had something as an example, like this 3D logo that I had copied into my libraries, if I pull that in, and it's just a pretty standard vector logo, if we wanted to bring that into any sort of document, if we switch the workspace from normal to workspace 3D, it kind of shifts things around, opens up a bunch of panels, sometimes moves the layer. What you can do with getting started is, if you have something like text or a vector object or anything that you can kind of create outlines from, you can create a 3D extrusion, which is taking any flat object and kind of pushing it back in 3D space and adding the geometry by just going to this and going to create. And it's going to switch you into this 3D space, which, again, kind of the benefit is you don't get bogged down in having to learn a whole new tool. It kind of turns all this stuff on for you. I know this text is super tiny in it, but it gives you a 3D version of that logo. You can get up here with your 3D mode camera tools and rotate the camera, pan it around, orbit, and kind of mimic the idea of moving around in 3D space. And kind of the benefit of this is all just stored on one layer as a smart object in Photoshop. So we can turn on and off kind of all the lighting and everything, but we can still do, if we click off of that, pretty standard Photoshop stuff. So it's not spitting out to some other program somewhere else and then coming in and doing layers and textures and stuff like that. It still kind of is housed within there, so we can still do all of our typical stuff. But kind of the basics and benefits of how this works is, if we're getting a 3D logo, it's going to pop open this 3D layer, which this is everything within our scene, which is kind of all the default lighting and materials and all of that. And then there's properties, which is kind of the second important part. So as opposed to kind of the typical, channel styles, there's these two panels that kind of house everything that would be in a full 3D program. And depending on what you have selected, it's going to show you the properties for that. So by default, it's going to give you this default light. If we click on that up here, where you can move where the shadows are falling based on that. Let me make this a little brighter so you can actually see what's going on. And it kind of gives you a little 3D world without, again, having to kind of make everything yourself. So you can kind of create shadows. And if we click on this logo, which is this SF logo that I brought in, it kind of breaks that apart for you and lets you select kind of the different parts of it that it created and adjust those. So if we just wanted to get off the ground and do something like grab this, take a look at properties. For each one of these, there's different properties of how it's dealing with each part of the geometry and what materials it's creating and kind of how it's working. So we take a look at any of these, we can see that they all have different properties, and for the whole thing there's these extra tiny little icons. But what we can do is really push this extrusion depth, which is how far back it's going to create this geometry, as well as bend and twist it if you want to kind of mess with it that way, taper it if you wanted to kind of go to a point, and adjust kind of what it's doing with these caps here. So this is kind of a big thing in 3D when you're kind of taking a 2D object, creating 3D out of it, making it look realistic and have light hitting it. If you look at kind of anything in the world, even if it's this flat, smooth Apple stuff, everything kind of always has some sort of bevel and edges. And what we can do with this is kind of adjust how we're rounding off those edges. And I'm going to push it there. And you're going to see, even just in a rough preview, what those kind of presets are doing to impact those edges and round those off. And again, kind of the benefit is that's kind of in its own layer, and if we're doing anything with that, we can still grab stuff like our textures and anything you might want to use. So if we had something like a texture, it's all contained, so we could put a texture on top of it. We could still change blending modes, blend it all together. We could grab the outlines of this layer by command clicking and restrict it to that with a mask. So again, the benefit is it's putting it in this world. It's still all kind of live and editable, and combining everything and letting you kind of do what you might already know with things like blending modes, layers, channels, any of that sort of stuff, and making it easier and kind of sitting within there. The other thing that's kind of cool is it makes things like setting up lighting and things like that pretty easily. So one thing that's really cool with kind of 3D is, rather than or in addition to kind of this default light, if we had something that was kind of a very reflective material, so if we just have reflections on all of these, it looks kind of white. One thing you can do, and this is kind of all of the stuff, the benefit is if you learn it in Photoshop and you kind of start dabbling into other 3D stuff, it's all kind of the same term, so it's not like it's ever lost knowledge or something that's not usable. But there's this image-based lighting tag as an example, and you could have a new texture and kind of, rather than reflecting different things, we could edit that and do something like grab other layers or images if we got kind of a different setup or kind of different HDR images that kind of look like this, to add additional lighting in there, which if I just save this, it kind of saves as a smart object. You can kind of quickly see what that's doing to the reflections in our logos. If we're talking about any like movies or visual effects or compositing, there's kind of the live action stuff of any scene that you're actually shooting. And then there's the stuff when we think about like Avengers or any of those movies that have all these characters that aren't actually there. As kind of this as an example, there's 3D elements that weren't actually there that you're dropping into a scene. So if those are going to look believable in the sake, or in the case of visual effects, it needs to look like it matches that environment. Otherwise, it's going to look super fake, and that's kind of what we had now pre like Terminator 2, and that's kind of the reference of when that really started to be noticed of it should be reflecting the actual environment that's around it. So image-based lighting and HDR images are kind of ways to take something that looks like this as an image, which is kind of a flattened version of a 360-degree view of things like different lighting setups. You kind of think about if you had a photo studio with different lights in different places and a character in the middle of it, and you kind of unwrap that into what would look like a flat image, it would look something like this. So if we're doing this sort of thing for like movies, when you're shooting, in the case of Avengers in New York, they would have lots and lots of images unwrapped that look like this of what that cityscape looks like. So there's the 3D models that would kind of sit in there, and then in the reflections you see what is actually in that area. And of how it works in Photoshop with this 3D, and again, this is kind of a universal concept for 3D stuff, is you can create a new material or a new texture. So let's just make this exactly the same aspect ratio as that one. And then same as the system of Photoshop layers, you could, this is kind of turning it off because it's just seeing a white image. But if we open up any of these quick examples I copied over, it's going to massively change how that looks because it's going to reflect or show different things in the reflections of that object if it's very reflective. So if it was something like, the carpet as an example is a pretty matte object, there's not really much reflections, you wouldn't see much, you'd maybe see like a little bit just because it's something there. But if we kind of quickly jump through these as an example. So there's a lot of possibilities. You can do a lot with logos and that sort of stuff. The other thing I wanted to get into is kind of how this other fun little app works. If you haven't downloaded this, definitely download it and check it out. It's still in kind of a beta preview version, but you can do a lot with it. It's Adobe Fuse. So if you search for it right now, it kind of still autocorrects to Muse, but it's Fuse with an F. But what this lets you do, and if anyone remembers or kind of plays any video games with that sort of stuff now, and is used to these kind of avatar character creators where you can kind of customize the face, or even with Xbox, I know you can kind of use the camera to take images of your own face and put it on characters. It's kind of that idea, but letting you kind of work with it and use it for stuff like Photoshop files or 3D animation, or even, if you wanted to kind of use their library stuff for mobile games without having to model characters and, really worry about breaking it and deal with actually, getting into some of the complexities. So how this kind of works, and it's super fun to mess around with if you haven't downloaded it yet, is it kind of starts you with different parts of constructing a character. So it's kind of our empty area, and then kind of the basic parts of a character. So head, torsos, legs, arms, and you can kind of combine different parts of different characters, which can get to look pretty weird pretty quickly. So one little shortcut that they have, which is useful, is if you don't want it to look very strange, you can right click and add matching parts. And the awesome part of this is it just does so much of the work for you. It kind of spins the wheel for a second, and then you don't have to worry about putting stuff together. It really just lets you kind of mold and move stuff like clay, as opposed to numbers and computer meters. So kind of how this works is it gives you this default character. You can kind of move around, pan around, kind of take a look at it. But what's really cool is there's kind of these 4 rooms. There's assemble, customize, clothing, and texture. And if you move through these, it's kind of the 4 parts of what you would do to kind of create a custom character out of kind of all their stuff that they've been continually kind of putting in it to give you options to kind of customize and change stuff. So it gives you base character, and what's cool is you kind of already start to hover over and light up and kind of see how you could move things. And all you have to do is grab any parts, and you can kind of see, if you wanted his head to be through a weird hat, his arms, biceps. And what it's actually doing is doing all kind of the sliders with restrictions behind the scenes. If you go in and customize, each one of these little parts is represented over here by this positive, negative slider meter. Everything from, if we kind of look at, want him to be, upset or kind of awkward or cocky about how this presentation is going, or happy or worried. And you can kind of see what's happening is, it kind of is working with itself to not let you break it. You could spend 20 minutes making this something. You could spend, hours kind of customizing it. There's also all of these randomized ones. So if you just wanted it to, randomize every single little feature, you can kind of click through it. You can kind of see everything it's moving and twisting. You could reset them and kind of just, work with this sort of thing. You can get into, if you want to really mess with what it's actually built out of, there's sets of tools to kind of, without getting the full suite of totally mess up this model, breaking tools, really manipulating, you can kind of see vertexes, lines, and curves, and then kind of work back and forth with that. Usefulness of this is it kind of works everything together and takes out some of the problems that might come up. So if you have a character model and it's going to be in a game or a movie, the next thing you would have clothes on it and hats and pants and stuff like that. And kind of what this does, it's taking whatever you just made, taking these default base clothing options, and that like couple seconds is it automatically snapping it. You can also give them pants, shorts, hats, shoes, whatever. Let's at least put a mask on them or something. You can add all this default stuff, and how these are built, all as an example, in this texture mode. If you click on any of these, it has kind of similar parts and sliders, and what's nice is it's very, very thorough, as it's kind of like, again, if you open up a 3D program, there's nothing there and you're building everything from scratch, or you're kind of pulling assets, you can mess things up, or the things project wrong or don't fit. But if we take a look at, even this jacket, it's setting it up as what a jacket is made out of instead of, texture A, B, C, D. So there's shirt, vest, buckles, and you can take any of these. So say the shirt as an example, or any of these, if you click it, it kind of works the same way as these other sliders were. So you can kind of change it, change the color, adjust it. You also could just throw other materials that it has built in on it. So we just click one of those, it's going to replace that material as it is on him with any one of these. And again, what's cool about this is it kind of takes the part out of it and kind of uses all the stuff that everyone keeps talking about with the libraries to kind of make that stuff easier. So what you can do when you're done is just these quick 2 buttons. If you save to CC libraries, it's going to let you save it into any of your photos. If I just do my library and I'll call this demo model new and go to save, it's gonna kind of, again, do all the pain in the butt work for you. Export that, and then you don't have to get a file or worry about keeping stuff on a drive. It's just gonna automatically show up in Photoshop just like other stuff does if you're getting stuff from Adobe stock. Or if we take a look at mine, in every Adobe app window, libraries, there's cloud storage where you can put assets and stuff, but rather than going and finding it, you can just add stuff to it. So I have a bunch of icons for Photoshop Fuse, and rather than going and finding those files on a hard drive every time I need it, it's just there. It's there in Illustrator, it's there in Photoshop, it's there in After Effects. So what that's doing is it's going to put that in the same spot. So what's super nice is on cue, as soon as I stop talking, whenever it goes, it should pop up the same thing whenever it gets to it there's a little, you can see it's refreshing that automatically. So in your libraries, it's going to show up and it's going to work in that same sort of 3D system, but it's going to come in that default T pose, which if you're doing motion capture is kind of just the resting pose, so you're not having things overlap or kind of things getting confused. And The really cool thing about this is same idea. This is just sitting on a layer, so we could have a background, have it sitting on there. But there is this skeleton as opposed to just the logo. It's just 3D extruded geometry. And again, taking the kind of work out of behind the scenes, all of this stuff basically of these motion capture animations of tons and tons of poses of running, jumping, kicking, all of these different options will pop up open properties. So kind of the uses would be if you're doing, even if you're doing like a poster or print design and you need some sort of character or you want to use that, but then if we add that one, you just click, and on the timeline you can see again without having to deal with if the skeleton's overlapping, if things are working. You can kind of look through these. You can try out all of these different ones. And the crazy thing is, if you look here, it's page 1 of 123. You can search. So if we just search like jump, you get different poses of all sorts of stuff. You can kind of take a look at it. So again, this is that one that we just made, and there's a lot of possibilities. You can do a lot with it already. If you are making a poster where you need some sort of character, again, it's all the same stuff. So, that's just a layer in Photoshop. You can also customize it. So the gas mask, as an example, it brings it in as a Photoshop file, so you could paint, add mask, add splatter, text, whatever. But it also gives you this little preview of exactly how the geometry is triangulated and broken down. So there's a lot of possibilities. Again, you could not get in the nitty-gritty at all, just build it, bring it to Photoshop, use all the templates. You can really open up those textures, adjust the geometry if you wanted to. And again, kind of the uses I could see of like if you're working with a game and you need to do like the poster or the box art and you want to get the characters and actually have it moving around. If you're doing something like a poster and rather than trying to get like stock photos of characters or something like that, or silhouettes. The Fuse are kind of building the character. The library of stuff is you can drop all these mocap things on it. If it's to the point of, and this is kind of just my opinion of, if you're trying to do more animation stuff, there is the timeline in Photoshop. The programs are overlapping so much as, there is, if you're familiar with After Effects, or again, if you start to do this a little in Photoshop and realize I can't get there, there's this very, After Effects familiar timeline of animation, of position, opacity, that sort of stuff, the 3D stuff, 3D lights if you wanted to move stuff, animate the materials, you can do all of that stuff. The benefits are you can get into Photoshop if, again, if you hit that ceiling, the other workload is uploading it, and then you can add rigging, and then you could get the models and do something like bring it in Cinema 4D and do whatever you want through the access of that stuff. So it's kind of, ceiling versus capabilities depending on what the project needs, what you want to do with it. But the main thing knowing, it's not like learning any software in this area is, a lost cause if you decide I want to use other ones, or, even if you go to a studio and they use other ones, that happens all the time. There's a lot you can do with it. The capability, it's whether you're doing, like you just want to do character design, or even if you're doing a potential photo shoot and you need a stand-in to communicate the idea, you could use it for that. Use it, just for games and that sort of stuff. If you're totally getting into 3D, you can use it for, animation. There's a lot you could do with it. It's definitely, something I was super excited to kind of mess around with and see how far you could push it, already, even though it's just kind of a preview. So like I mentioned, shameless plug, I do have on my site, motiontutorials.net, a lot of tutorials on that point of if you're used to other stuff, but you've never used 3D or used some 3D, whole section on Fuse, Cinema 4D, Cinema 4D Lite, Element 3D, kind of anything going on in the 3D industry. Definitely check that out. I post tutorials pretty often. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming. It's stuff I was super excited about. Do you like watching these tutorials and want to see more episodes more often? You can help keep the show going by lending your support on Patreon at patreon.com/SeanFrangella. More importantly, if you want to throw in a couple extra bucks, you can get bonus content like project files used in the tutorials, answers to direct questions, live hangouts for questions, and even request specific tutorial topics for me to use for my next video. Also be sure to subscribe to the show by clicking the subscribe button or visiting the show homepage at youtube.com/SeanFrangella. And if you're hip with social media and have a question about this tutorial, you can find me on Twitter at SeanFrangella. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you at the next video.